Hello and welcome to a MimicHobby painting guide. So today we're going to be painting Astarion. This model was designed by Bogomancer and it's actually the first time we've painted this model, whilst Parker has painted 9 Astarions overall. It's the first time he's done this particular one designed by Bogomancer. So we are going to call this his 10th and final Astarion.
I'm sure it'll be adequate.
Parker's first step for most models he paints is a grayscale pre-shade. After the parts are mounted and primed dark grey, he begins with a light coat of neutral grey ink. He then moves on to a dry brushing stage. Using titanium white on his palette, he makes sure the brush is well covered all over in the paint. He then wipes it all off, and I mean wipe it all off. For me personally, I often accidentally leave too much paint on the brush and then it's just not doing the job of dry brushing anymore. You want to use a rag to wipe off as much as you can, basically until it's back to being dry. The pigment or residue will still remain on the brush, and this is what you want to be using to brush over those raised surfaces. He does this step to help pick up all the textures on the pieces. He then goes back in with a white ink layer to blend it all together. Sometimes after using a larger dry brush, he then goes back over with a smaller dry brush to get some of those finer details. It's quite useful in places like this where the hair all overlaps and other harder to reach places. The grayscale pre-shade will play an important part in the process for this model, so it is important to get it accurate at this early stage. Now moving on to his outfit. To preserve that zenithal shade, Parker masks off the sections he's not going to be painting at this stage. He's starting with the blue part of Astarion's tunic, so we're using this masking putty from AK to protect the belt and mark the edge of the blue tunic where it goes into the burgundy section. This metal sculpting tool is really useful for getting the putty into the right spots. For the tunic, Parker used indigo blue ink through the airbrush. As always, he begins building up light layers to get the desired coverage in the right areas. Parker then uses a Prussian blue ink to mark out the shadows to his blue tunic. Where he has the gold detailing, the reference images show that it pinches in the cloth of the tunic, which would therefore create a recessed area. He then goes back to pick out highlights again with the dry brushing technique, this time using a pale phthalo blue colour to complement the tunic colour. Then back in again with Prussian blue to further exaggerate those highlights and shadows. Parker's method of painting involves applying multiple semi-transparent layers to gently build up the colours. This gives the material a soft gradient from the deepest shadow colour to the upper highlight colour. It's a method that does require patience and careful airbrush control, but it is totally worth practicing as it gives a great effect in the final piece. Now it's time to enjoy a mask peel. You can see what a clean line this leaves behind, ready to work on the next section of the tunic. For his boots, Parker used a mixed light brown base, again slowly building the layers with additional layers in these creases. He then moves on to an ink stage using raw umber and then sepia ink. He likes these because they are semi-transparent by nature and are great for his method of painting. They strongly tint the area where needed, but allow some of the previous colour to show through, creating a blend on the model. This ink darkens the shadows and creases in Astarion's boots. On to his trousers, or chaps. The masking putty comes in handy once again here, and Parker marks off the coloured section from the brown leather section. For this colour, it was important to make it distinctive from the brown Parker has already used. So, whilst it's similar here, he used a different brown mix adjusted slightly to add variety. Another important reason for using multiple thin layers is that they dry much quicker. This means Parker can go back over for the next layer fairly soon after the first without the paint pooling. You work your way around the shape in light layers so that when you circle around back to the starting point, the paint should be dry enough for another layer. Then we come to that ink stage of Parker's painting process. This time for the shadows he is using a mix of Antelope brown and sepia ink, carefully spraying around the edges where the two colours meet. Now that the tunic has had some dry time, we can pick it back up for the next stage, oil wash. It is recommended to apply a coat of varnish and leave overnight before applying the oil, as it is heavily diluted with mineral spirits and it can potentially react with the paint underneath. Parker uses ABT Prussian Blue mixed with mineral spirit. The mix has only quite a small amount of paint, around 10 to 20%, to get this blue oil wash ready. He generously applies all over the blue tunic. To adequately stain the colour, it needs to be left to sit for 20 minutes or so we get back to the trousers to put it through a similar process. This time he uses Payne's Grey and mixes with acrylic medium, ultramatte medium and a flow improver to get a similarly watery consistency. The difference here is that the oil wash will have a much higher flow and staining power and can be manipulated to dry very evenly with its longer working time. The acrylic wash on the trousers is only intended to fill the recesses of the design and form a base coat for painting over, so an oil wash is unnecessary for this task. Now Parker can go back to finish the oil wash process on the tunic. He wipes off some excess in the raised areas, leaving behind just the stained colour on the piece. Here he mixes Payne's Grey and Phthalo Green Blue acrylics to create his dark turquoise colour on the wet palette. Another favourite tool of Parker's is this beauty blender. Using a sponge, he covers one side in the paint and proceeds to dab over the ink-stained trousers. The shape and application of the sponge allows you to build up an even coating of paint quickly without ever getting any unwanted paint into the recessed texture. For the burgundy parts of his tunic, Parker mixed magenta, crimson and dioxazine violet to create this gradient of colours on his wet palette. This time applying with a paintbrush, he fills in the section of Astarion's tunic. This part of Astarion's outfit is kind of suede material, so has this mottling effect. To achieve this look, he again used the sponge to dab a slightly different shade, using white into the mix to create a variation to the one he painted all over. Using the airbrush, Parker uses magenta and burgundy inks to blend the sponge dabbing and the base colour. Now it's time for those gold details. Hopefully you've caught our gold recipe on Patreon or Instagram. If you haven't, he uses Vallejo Metacolor Gold with an additional gold pigment and then flow improver. For Astarion, he used brilliant gold pigment. In our short gold recipe video, you can see some examples of other pigment and how they look. Astarion has a lot of gold detailing in his outfit, so you'll need some patience and a steady hand. For this process, Parker uses an older Green Stuff World sable brush. These metallic mixes can ruin brushes quite easily, so it is good advice to keep an older brush aside, specifically for applying the metallics, and don't ruin your best brushes. Astarion's sleeves are a pretty simple light grey colour. He undercoats with darker greys in the creases of the sleeves and light grey on the main areas of the sleeves. This process used a bit more careful brush painting to get into the shapes and folds of the sleeve. Then he runs a neutral grey through the airbrush to blend the colour out to a smooth coat while still retaining the highlights and shadows of the brush layers. Where his sleeves meet his cuffs, we have a bit more careful detail to do. This time it's using a mix of Pyrrole Red and Red Oxide to carefully line the cuff. This is the same colour mix that was used to line the red trim and thread detail on the tunic. The top of the sleeve where it meets the tunic is a mixed shade of brown that was also used for the belt. Again, careful brush application will help you line this neatly. As we move on to the belt, Parker mixed a slightly different but complementary shade of brown again, this time using burnt umber, Mars yellow and red oxide. This doesn't need a brush as fine as the gold detailing required, and here he is using one of his best brushes, a Raphael red sable brush of which he owns several sizes. However, on the belt there is some smaller sculpted in detail. For this, he used a lighter shade from the brown he had mixed on his palette and carefully painted in these details. For the boots we get a fresh colour. Using red violet, light phthalo blue and white, he creates a blend of purple to paint onto the leg wraps, mixing up the shades of purple across the wrap. These have that suede mottling look to them, so the sponge comes in handy once again for creating the impression of a variety of texture. He dabs in some lighter purple before blending back out with some Cerelean blue ink through the airbrush, as it needed a little push towards a bluer hue overall. Okay, now we are back to brown. So here he uses a darker brown based on the previous mix with some sepia ink added for the extra staining power and slightly thinned to something closer to a wash consistency. With a brush application, he carefully paints in the straps around the leg wrap, and there we have his outfit complete. Next up, he needs a weapon to hold. This model has two options and we couldn't decide, so we ended up magnetising the hands so that the daggers can be swapped over whenever you like. To get a nice shiny dagger, Parker starts with a nice glossy black base using golden high flow black. He uses jet exhaust Vallejo metal colour to give a dark all over coat on each dagger, and then selectively sprays in some pale burnt metal from the same range to add some depth. Parker then finishes these up with a dry brushing stage. Now Astarion just needs some skin. Astarion is of course a very pale vampire. Getting skin this pale can be tricky for some, and you also need to consider the undertones for the pale skin you're looking to do. We discussed this more in depth in a recent Patreon video. Sometimes with colour mixing, it can take a bit of experimenting to find the right shade. Initially, Parker started applying this shade, but was finding it too pink and was concerned it might lead to a skin tone that was too warm. It needed some adjustments, so by adding some blue, he created a cooler undertone. Once he mixed some blue in too, it gave Parker this purple mix undertone, which ultimately mainly utilised these colours: Titan Violet Pale, Titan Mars Pale, Red Violet, and Cobalt Teal. He applied with a brush varying the shades across his face, roughly sketching the contours and shapes of the face. By positioning darker and lighter areas at this stage, it will help define the shapes of the face as the airbrush layer is added on top. Next step, he airbrushed layers of a Violet and Titan Mars Pale mix, giving this lovely pale skin tone. Parker's go-to next step is the use of pastels. We get a lot of questions about pastels, with people saying they can't make them stick. It's not something we've had trouble with, but after discussions with people in our community, we've come to a collective conclusion that the cheap pastels aren't going to do the job. If you want pastels to work effectively and stick to your model properly, you do need to be getting artist pastels of a good quality. Parker uses the Cerelean brand, and for Astarion here he used two colours, Van Dyke Violet and Vermilion Brown. Breaking off a small piece and ground into a powder prepares the pastels for application. Parker applies with a sponge applicator tool and a brush in any places he wants to slightly darken, like inside the ears, around the jawline, and to help define some of the mouth lines. It's also useful for in between the fingers and the palms. He then uses a clean sponge to wipe off the excess, leaving behind the pigment of the pastel in the desired places. Next up is some face details. Parker paints in his lips with Goth Skin ink by Green Stuff World using a Raphael Red Sable size 0 brush. His method for lips is to gently glaze several transparent layers over each other, putting more layers on the areas to be darker and leaving less layers in the lighter areas to create the volume. For his eyes, Parker starts with a wash of the same Goth Skin colour. It is just a really useful colour for several parts of the face. Then, using titanium white mixed with a very small amount of Goth Skin to carefully paint out the eye shape. Astarion has red eyes, for which he used cadmium red and orange acrylics. When painting eyes, Parker likes to very carefully paint in almost pixel by pixel to make sure he doesn't overshoot the shape. He will paint in the iris shape first, adding some highlights and variation to the colour, before painting in the pupil with a black Indian ink for its glossy finish that catches the light nicely. All that was left was a finishing touch to the hair with some pure white ink and to paint the fingernails. He uses the same mix for the skin, slightly darkened to paint the base of the fingernail and slightly lightened for the tip. Finally, we have the base. This model has a nice simple base, so it just took a few steps. First of all, Park used Citadel contrast paint in the Basilicanum Grey for the stones. He then used a mix of Titan Buff and Burnt Sienna for the pathway between the rocky stones, again applying with a sponge to get this uneven colouring across the tiles. He then lightly dry brushes across the tiles with a titanium white before giving it a final layer of sepia ink to darken the sides of the pathway. And here is our final model. Hope you enjoyed watching us paint Astarion today. If you'd like to learn about some of these techniques more in depth, please do hop over to our Patreon or Discord. And with that, I would like to thank our patrons for their support. Thank you to those on screen, as well as our students and apprentices. Thank you to Seth the Overwitch, Ryan Allen the 3D Acolyte, Malik Thomas, Elisa May, Arash Musavi, Swanga, Funky Monk, and Dabby. Thank you all so much, and we'll catch you in the next one.